Good morning. Good morning. I hope everyone can see our slides. We just want to thank everyone for joining us today. We are so glad that you joined us. Today's presentation is being brought to you by ESI and Eeoc Law Firm. Today's topic is COVID-19 vaccines, return to the office, recruiting and retention, some very timely topics for everyone. Today's presentation is going to be hosted by Carol Keogh, Sheila Price, Carla Saenz, and Michael Weaver. So we just want to talk to you a little bit about some housekeeping items. Today's webinar is being recorded and we will be sharing the presentation with you. So there are some links and also some other presentation information we will send out to you shortly after our webinar. We do encourage participation, so we ask that you would put any of your chat questions or any of your questions you may have in the Q&A, and we will answer a few of them as we are doing the presentation today. And as always, this webinar is not suitable for legal advice, so we definitely ask that you check with your attorney or your PEO or HR professional. Of course, our agenda today, as we mentioned, we are going to be talking about vaccines in the workplace, employer guidance, and kind of, can you mandate a vaccine or can you not, and kind of the pitfalls there. We're also going to be talking about returning to work. And what are the legal and practical issues? And as you as the employer, what should you do when asking your employees to return to the workforce? And also recruiting and retention. Lots of people are leaving their jobs, lots of people are looking for jobs. And so we're going to kind of talk about some out of the box ideas in recruiting and also retention, and why it's important to involve your employees in the retention aspect of things. So let's just dive right into it.
All right, well, good morning, everyone. I am going to start this off by talking a little bit about employers can mandate the vaccine, but do they want to? So when I give you a little bit of information, you can see that you do have a choice as an employer as to whether or not to provide mandatory vaccines. The EEOC does provide guidance on mandatory vaccine, and business necessity is the key. So let me tell you a little bit of the EEOC updated guidance. Employers under this guidance may require workers who enter the physical work site to receive a COVID-19 vaccine without violating the ADA or Title VII or GINA, which is the Genetic Information Non-Disclosure Act. Employers may also require proof of a vaccine status. So you're allowed to do it. The EEOC permits people to do it. But do you want to? You've got to keep in mind, mandatory vaccine policies are not one size fits all. If vaccines are going to be mandated, you must show the business necessity of such a program for your workplace. So for example, a service that provides caregivers to the elderly and disabled in their homes, you can understand why that employer might mandate the vaccine to protect the clients so that they cannot get exposure or even potential exposure to COVID-19. Well, what about a road crew that repairs potholes outside? What would be the business necessity for a mandatory policy? So you have to look at those factors yourself and think about whether or not the mandated vaccine is for you, or maybe you want to take a different approach that we're going to talk about as well. So let's look at the legal exceptions to mandatory vaccine. And by a legal exception, I mean, if you have a legal exception, if you employ 15 or more employees, you must accommodate a firmly held religious belief against vaccinations, or someone who is disabled or has a medical reason why the employee cannot be vaccinated. So what if you are smaller than 15? Well, Title VII does not require employers with less than 15 employees to accommodate persons that cannot be vaccinated. However, the best practice would be to offer such an accommodation anyway. It's just because part of doing the mandatory vaccine policy is you have to look at your employees. You want goodwill at your work site. You want them wanting to work for you. So you have to listen to them. And making an accommodation, even if you're not required by law, is something you want to consider or think about. So here's something the EEOC did. They looked at pregnant employees who cannot be vaccinated and found that the employer must offer an accommodation such as job modifications, changes to work schedules, telework, if they would offer those accommodations to other employees who were similar in their inability to work due to a mandatory policy. Accommodations that pose an undue hardship for the employer's operation may relieve the employer of some of these accommodations, but not all of them. So let's look at, I'm sure you've heard about this, the test case. Methodist Hospital had a mandatory vaccine policy, and of course, they were sued. The employees sued for wrongful termination when Methodist fired them for not getting vaccinated. The court dismissed the employee's case because if employees do not want to get vaccinated, they always have the ability to quit and get another job. The main plaintiff claimed that she was being required to be a human guinea pig, the drug only had emergency approval, and the threat of termination by Methodist is like a forced medical experiment in violation of the Nuremberg Code. Well, the court rejected all of those arguments and said, if a worker in the ordinary workplace were to refuse an assignment, refuse to change offices, had a different time, or was given some other directive, the employer could still fire them. And so the court said the employer can place limits on worker behavior. It is all part of the bargain of working. The plaintiff and 117 other plaintiffs lost, but they may appeal. So keep watching to see how this pans out as mandatory vaccines possibly work their way all the way through the system. And the last thing I want to talk about is confidentiality. So as you probably are aware, there are privacy rights of employees in the workplace for medical information, and vaccinations are considered to be medical information. And so just like if someone contracts COVID-19 in the workplace, you are required to keep this information confidential, as well as any request for accommodation based on a disability. All of this has to be kept confidential. And the information has to be stored in a separate confidential file, separate from the employee's regular file. And GINA, if you understand what GINA is, this is collecting genetic information. So you also would want to keep the information confidential because the employer can ask for vaccination cards without a violation. But the caveat to that is you have to use confidentiality. So now we are going to move on to alternatives to mandatory vaccine policy with Carla.
Yep. So as Carol mentioned, you want to determine what's best for your business based off of business necessity. But if you determine that maybe a voluntary policy is better for your business, some things to consider would be, what does that really look like in practice? So when I think of a voluntary policy, I think about kind of going to the grocery store. And before, when you went in, you were masked, and so was everyone that works there. And now when you walk in, there's certain employees that are still masked and some that are not. So I imagine that's kind of what the voluntary policy looks like in theory, right? So vaccines are encouraged but not required in this scenario. Employees would then still be required to show proof of vaccination if they wanted to go unmasked. You could also do things like modified work shifts. So if you're able to do that, something that you could implement would be to, let's say, incorporate some type of hybrid method where some employees kind of come in Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, others Tuesdays and Thursdays, to kind of maintain some of that. The other thing you could do is offer incentives, and we're going to talk about incentives a little bit more next. You also want to be careful with these voluntary policies that you're still adhering to safety policies and practices. So if you, like we mentioned, there are some employees who are not vaccinated, maybe still considering a vaccine, and that's okay. So what are you doing then to kind of make sure that they still feel comfortable coming into the workplace? Next slide.
All right, so now we're going to move right into, does the EEOC allow employers to offer incentives to employees? And the answer is sometimes. And the answer sometimes is because you have to look at the situation of the employer and the vaccine and how it is being distributed to your employees. So the employer is not given carte blanche to offer incentives to get employees vaccinated at the workplace. So here's the two different fact situations. The first is the employer does not provide the vaccine and does not contract with a third party to provide the vaccine. Second, the employer provides the vaccine or hires a third party to provide the vaccine. Now, when there's a non-employer provided vaccine, requesting proof of a vaccine is not going to be a disability related question. It's not going to violate the ADA, as long as you're looking for the information in a voluntary way. An employer can offer an incentive to employees who prove they're vaccinated. Now, if they offer a very large incentive though, it may be difficult for the employer to say that it's not pressuring its employees to reveal what is private health information. This wouldn't be acceptable. So like $1,000 for one vaccination may be too much money. But here's the key for employers, which is tricky, is like most guidance under the EEOC, there's no bright line, all right? There is no too big, too small. You know, the employers are kind of left to do what works best for them, but keeping in mind that it can't be such a large amount that the employees feel they're forced to take it. So I know one local restaurant that offered their employees $50 in cash as a bonus for going and getting the vaccine. And that it probably would pass the EEOC guidelines. But there's the second set of facts that I mentioned, and this is where an employer, they actually give the vaccine at work. They make appointments for employees, they hire the third party to give the vaccines. Information which is required to get a vaccine in the United States requires pre-screening. And when you have pre-screening, some of the information there is prohibited questions under the ADA, unless the information is given voluntarily. So the way the EEOC looks at this is they can offer incentives, but if they are so excessive to be coercive, when they get medical questionnaires required by the employer, then that is not going to be acceptable. So you have to walk the fine line, and it's not always easy to do that as the employer, but you have to think more in simple ways. And Carla's going to help us a little more with that. But employers must consider one other thing, and that is you have a neutral policy basically that you would like your employees to get vaccinated, or you would encourage them to get vaccinated. But you have to consider, does this policy that you have any kind of a negative impact on certain individuals when offering incentives? Because some employees may be more affected by vaccines than others. So if you have a vaccine policy where everybody's going to get vaccinated at your place after work, and there are parents or a mother maybe that can't do that because she has to go pick up her child from childcare, you have to consider what the impact is on her if you don't offer an alternative time to be vaccinated or some other way to be vaccinated. So it's a consideration the employer has to take, because there could be a potential for different kinds of discrimination under Title VII, particularly with mandatory policies. So you want to look at that. And now we're just going to move right into Carla talking about incentives for vaccination.
Mm-hmm. So once you determine that you're interested in taking advantage of these incentives, implementing a policy about the incentives you're going to offer, I want to give you some ideas. You can do paid or unpaid time off to obtain a COVID-19 vaccination. So if you're not under the FFCRA for this year, you've opted out of that, but you can still do something. Someone that's doing this is McDonald's. They announced that they are offering 4 hours of paid time off for their employees to get vaccinated. You can do cash bonuses upon proof of vaccination. An employer that's doing this is Kroger. They announced that they are offering their employees $100 if they show proof of vaccination. Something else you could do is employer sponsored functions. So for those that achieve a goal, so if you want to kind of have fun with it, you can have certain goals. Let's say once we get 30% of vaccinations, we'll do maybe a luncheon. Once we hit 50%, you do something different. You can promote that type of function in your workplace if you want to do that. You can also do raffles for prizes. So you can have those that have been vaccinated show proof and enter for some kind of raffle for either gift cards or some other fun prizes. You can even do like more PTO in their bank, right? Something different that Target is doing, they announced that they are offering rides. So they've partnered with Lyft. So they are paying for their employees to have rides to go to vaccination sites and then return to work or home. In addition to that, they're also offering up to 4 hours of paid time off for any hourly employees so that they are free to get vaccinated without any concerns about what that's going to mean for their paycheck. Next slide. All right, so now that you have some ideas about what you want to do, you want to think about what your policy is going to look like. So we have some ideas for your vaccine policy checklist. So you want to decide if your policy will be mandatory or voluntary. So again, you want to think about the business necessity that Carol talked about. Is there a business need that mandates vaccines in your workplace? And if it does, I mean, what does that look like? Do you have to have a vaccine to return to an in-office setting? Do you have to have a vaccine to travel for business purposes or to visit with customers or vendors? And really make sure that's defined. You also want to define who's going to make these accommodation decisions. So part of that would be to train your managers. More likely than not, your managers are going to be the ones that are hearing your employees' concerns. They're going to be the ones that the employees go to about leave requests or accommodation requests. So your managers need to be prepared with understanding what that means when they're asked about these things and then how to respond. So we hope that you have someone in place, a designated, maybe your HR representative or your PDO or your attorney to help you with this, and then to let your managers know that. And it's not just good enough to tell the managers, go talk to HR. You want the managers to know that when they do that, that they follow up with HR and say, hey, you know, so-and-so had a concern about this, and here's what that was. You also want to define whether or not you're going to allow for time off for vaccines. So, and what does that look like? Is it going to be paid time off or unpaid time off? Or are they going to have to use their PTO bank if they have one? Or is there additional time off that you're going to offer for this? And what about time off for those that have adverse reactions to the vaccine? So some vaccines have adverse effects like flu-like symptoms. So your employees may not feel good the next day or the next few days. And how are those leave requests going to be handled? And then what about incentives? We just talked about that. So are there going to be incentives tied to this program? If there are, you want to outline what the criteria is to achieve that incentive. And then think about, what if there's an adverse reaction that we talked about? Is that something that's recordable under workers' comp? Is that something that they would have compensation for under your workers' compensation policy? Okay, next slide.
So Carla, we did have a question. This is Cheryl. Hey, so if they have that adverse reaction, is it covered under workers' comp, or does that depend on each policy?
Yeah, Michael, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so if this was workers' comp covers sudden and fortuitous injuries or claims that were not predictable. So if an employee were to get COVID and it's clearly defined that it came from work, if you got infected at work, not from the vaccine, then it could be a compensable claim covered by workers' comp. However, if this was a mandated effect where you mandated your employees to have the vaccine and they were to have adverse reactions, there's an increased likelihood that it would not be covered by workers' comp because it's not sudden, it's not fortuitous, and it's may not be something that is actuarially predictable. So if it's mandated, increased likelihood, it's not covered, and if it's not mandated, more of a chance that it is.
Thank you, Michael.
Carol?
Oh, all right. We're going to skip now over to returning your employees to work and some of the issues involved in that. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about the issues for employers to resolve when your employees come back to work. What kinds of things do you have to do at the workplace? How do you handle their reactions their fears still of COVID. I think we've been out of circulation so long here with COVID, not really getting to see each other and working together, even though we have Zoom, it's not quite the same thing. And so there will be issues for the employer to resolve. There are also going to be some legal pitfalls that you want to be looking at, because there are going to be some rules about the safe return to work. And the last thing we're going to do is we're going to handle some employee issues about bringing employees back to the workplace. So now we're going to talk about how can managers calm fears about returning to work. Carla?
So most fears and anxieties come from a lack of understanding. So either a lack of understanding of a current situation or of an unknown future. So the way that managers can combat some of those fears and anxieties is with information. So you want to fill those voids with information and act with empathy. And of course, as a leader, you want to be present. So you want to maintain an open dialogue. And what we mean by that is you want to be transparent with your plans and your expectations. So if you want to return employees to an in-office setting, you want to let them know that's something you're thinking about. A good way to get how they feel about that is you could send out like an employee survey and say, hey, how do you feel about coming together for, at the end of August, for example. So you want to keep an open dialogue. You want to convey any guidelines and safety protocols that you're taking. So if you're going to bring people back to an in-office setting but require masks, or that you have that vaccine policy, right? So think about that. You also want to understand that employees really have genuine concerns and questions about how the organization is doing. So have sales dropped? And if they have, what are we doing to increase revenue? Those things tie into their comfort at work and with their job, right? You also want to take a holistic approach to employee well-being. So check in with your employees, see how they're doing. Everyone's been impacted by this in one way or another. There's been a lot of loss, fear, anxiety about what's going on. So again, fill those voids with communication. You can do things like offer flexible work schedules. If someone has more of a workload because you've had furloughs or you're having trouble filling jobs, talk to them about that. What are some things you can do to get some of that stuff off their plate? You can also encourage things like taking time off. Encourage employees to do that. Set an example by doing that yourself. And you also want to model calm and resilient behavior. So this is what we talk about when we're talking about being present and leadership's being present. So if you're going to ask employees to return to work, are your leaders returning to work? Are they wearing their masks? Are they doing the things that are setting that example that they care a lot about the employees' well-being? You want to also communicate with empathy. So again, just check in with your employees, have those one-on-ones, or have room in your discussions, whether you have team meetings or however you meet, make time for that kind of discussion. The other thing you can do is make sure that you have town halls. You can do anonymous surveys. Again, just checking in regularly, seeing how people feel, and then being flexible. So there might be times where you have to adjust. If you plan on reopening an office setting in August, but then something happens, you have to push that out. That's okay. Just continue to communicate with employees, because that information and communication go a long way with calming fears and anxieties. Next slide.
So when you have employees return to work, we have to keep in mind that there are going to be some things about the safety at the workplace that the employer still has to address. So safety has been like a strong motivator for employers throughout the pandemic. Many of them had pandemic policies that were recommended by their attorneys, recommended by HR, and both federal and Texas law require employers to protect employees and keep the workplace safe. Many employers had policies and procedures that handled those workplace issues about hygiene, about mask wearing. All of these different things helped the employers and gave guidelines to the employees. Some employers actually never brought their work staff back, and they actually had them at home for most of the time during the pandemic and had them teleworking. And so they had teleworking policies. But some employers like H-E-B and Kroger and Walgreens and CVS, all of those essential types of businesses, they had no choice. They had to bring employees back to work. Under federal law, The basic obligation to provide a safe workplace free from known hazards is under OSHA 29 USC 654. And it has already been determined that a known hazard is COVID-19. All right, so you do have some obligation under this basic general law to provide a safe workplace. And employers tried very hard to follow that along with the other types of guidance that they were being given through the CDC and through OSHA. But now, basically, the pandemic landscape has changed, okay? So some workers are vaccinated, some are not vaccinated. Some workers continue to work in industries that may pose a greater hazard than other industries. Some workers have never returned to the workplace yet. And some may face other types of work situations, hybrid work, all different kinds of situations that the employer has to consider about the safety issues. So President Biden, through an executive order, asked OSHA to create a temporary emergency standard. And that is located at 29 CFR 1910 ETS subpart U. And what that is basically is the temporary emergency standard. They've decided that only in one main industry. So for those in the healthcare industry who provide healthcare services or healthcare support services, an emergency temporary standard is needed to address the hazard. And this standard is to protect the employees who work in hospitals, nursing homes, assisted living, emergency responders, home healthcare workers, and ambulatory care facilities. So some of the things that are required and they're mandatory for the employer would be a written COVID-19 plan if there's more than 10 employees, designating a safety coordinator, hazard assignment, policies and procedures where you're going to minimize the risk in this particular industry. All the areas which most employers already provided during the pandemic, are now legally required, such as limits points of entry, PPE, aerosol prevention, physical distancing, physical barriers, cleaning and disinfection, ventilation, health screening, vaccination, training, anti-retaliation, and all of these things at no cost to the employer, the employee, and certain record keeping is required under a temporary emergency standard. So guidance for other employers in the world of vaccinated and unvaccinated workers, and OSHA has given certain guidance to consider, and I've put there for you where you can go and look up this basic information. But what you need to know is, other than the employers that fall in the TES, temporary emergency standard category, you need to go to OSHA and find all the requirements for your business. Fully vaccinated employees under the TES even are going to be exempt from masking, distancing, and barrier requirements, but only when it's a well-defined area. There's no reasonable expectation there that they'll be subject to suspected or confirmed COVID-19. So under this URL that I've put in up here for you to rely on, you can find out for vaccinated and unvaccinated employees in other workplaces. And what you're really going to find is pretty much OSHA has come in line with the CDC guidelines. And so you're going to have to look at that and be familiar with that. So in order for you to understand what kinds of things you can do in the workplace that may be very different from what we did during the height of the pandemic. Also, people are not aware that Texas law also has a non-delegable duty imposed by law on the basis of concern for public safety. And it's imposed by the common law, statute, or regulation. So the Texas Supreme Court, in a case called Leach versus Hornsby, discusses that an employer is not responsible for being the insurer of an employee's safety, but at the same time, it is a non-delegable duty for them to provide a safe workplace for their employees. And by non-delegable means you can't place the blame on somebody in your workplace and turn it over to them. You, the employer, have that responsibility, and you can't delegate your responsibility to anyone else. So that puts the duty on the employer to be aware of what the hazards are and what things can and cannot be done in the workplace. So let's go to the next slide. So here's some things for you to consider. Employers have legal responsibility when the employee refuses to return to work. So what are we looking at here? In this new world of vaccinated and unvaccinated, we are looking at the guidance that I told you about, the CDC guidance and the OSHA guidance. And the difference between guidance and regulations or rules or the TES standard is that the employer under a TES standard must adhere to every requirement. And if you don't do it, if you fail to do it, you could result in your business being cited and penalties being assessed by OSHA. Guidance is not like that. Guidance is not required to be followed. There is encouragement that you would follow it as you try to keep your workplace safe, but there is more discretion to the employer. Under the guidance, the employer can allow fully vaccinated employees now to work indoors in many situations without wearing masks, social distancing, or undergoing COVID-19 screenings, because that's what the CDC has allowed and that's what OSHA is allowing. However, keep in mind, all restrictions at the workplace cannot be lifted if there are unvaccinated employees and these employees that have special risks, immune deficiencies. So every employer has to analyze hazards in their workplace in determining what protective equipment is still required, if any, or are ordinary masks going to be allowed? And when some workers are vaccinated and others are not vaccinated, how do you protect these workers in the workplace? And what can you do without taking the chance that you're going to be discriminating against vaccinated or unvaccinated workers? So you want them to be able to join in all of the things that the workplace allows. So if you have certain meetings that you want everybody to attend, you may allow some of the people to attend the meeting by Zoom, and other people can attend the meeting in person. So you're going to have to figure out the rules and what applies to your workplace. And this is going to be a little bit tricky, but it takes time for you to analyze this and look at your workplace. It's going to be totally different for someone who has 3 employees versus somebody who has 50 employees. So that's why the employer has that discretion to figure out what's going to work for them. And one of the other things is keeping in mind that working without masks for the majority of workers outside is going to be permitted, even for unvaccinated workers. But unvaccinated workers still are going to have some types of restrictions. You may need them to continue to wear face masks or do distancing or proper ventilation, barriers, hygiene, hand washing, all of those things that we've already been doing over this last year may still need to be in place when you have unvaccinated workers. And one of the things that you need to keep in mind also is you're going to have vaccinated workers who may want to wear masks at work, who may want to still carry on with some of the same requirements for unvaccinated workers. And that's because they may have someone at home, young children, a baby, or people who cannot be vaccinated and they want to protect them. So that's another area for the employer to explore. And finally, in Texas, just recently, a new law was passed and it was called the Pandemic Liability Protection Act. And that provides protection for employers and businesses and other organizations against injuries from COVID-19. It was just signed into law, so we're not sure exactly how that's going to operate. But one of the things it does do is it sets a high threshold to prove workplace injury. And of course, you can still catch COVID-19 at the workplace, but can you prove it was the fault or the negligence of the employer? And this law is some protection for the employer as they move through some of these tricky areas. Now we're going to jump to what to do if your employer refuses to return to work. COVID-19 controls and prevention.
Yeah, so when your employees are coming back to work, this is a short synopsis of the hierarchy of controls that you can do to help control and prevent COVID. But do know that you're not alone in this. This is something you can reach out to us for assistance with. You can email risk@eesipeo. We will work with you on your options here. Go through what's feasible, what's practical, what's applicable. So the first hierarchy controls, you want to eliminate COVID in your workspace, in your place. You can do this through screening. You can try to, you can do temperature checks, COVID tests, you can do symptoms tests, verbal tests, you can do a screening. The most important thing to remember here is that your protocols for worker screening must be applied equally without discrimination, which includes people who are vaccinated or not. If you wanted to do a COVID test, still have to do a COVID test on people who are not, who are vaccinated. There is a variant that is coming around, so COVID is a recognized hazard even with a vaccination still. That's work on eliminating COVID. If you want to engineer the control, there's physical barriers, there's ventilation. Physical barriers could be the plexiglass, they could be the distance, they could be changing the workstations to where nobody's near each other. So there's physical barriers you can do, or distance control. Like Carol said earlier, if you're outside, you don't need a mask. And inside, with enough ventilation, it is considered outside. So with enough ventilation, this includes exhaust, not just fans coming in, but exhaust going out, removing the air from inside. With enough ventilation, this could be a plausible control to help you control and prevent COVID inside. Administratively, Carla said earlier, you can alternate your shifts between vaccinated employees, unvaccinated employees. That's not necessarily discrimination, but it's an administrative control. You can limit the employee count of who's at each station, who's at each shift. When it comes to sanitation, increase the frequency, increase the area that you're sanitizing. Employees can work remotely, another administrative control. So when it comes to personal protective equipment, this should actually be one of the last steps in the hierarchy of controls. You want to eliminate the hazard first. You don't want to just supply training or PPE, personal protective equipment. That should be one of the last steps. When it comes to PPE, one of the overlooked items is the gloves. Gloves need to be changed routinely. We have face masks, we have eye protection, but gloves, contact with any products, with any common areas, with vaccinated or unvaccinated should be gloved, and those gloves should be changed frequently. There are 2 links at the bottom that give much more detailed information as far as what your hierarchy of controls can be at work. Though do know you can reach out to risk@eesipeo, and we'll come out and we'll work with you on this. Explore your options and make sure we're controlling and preventing COVID in the workplace together. So moving on to the next slide.
We have another question.
Yeah.
So should employers continue the temperature checks that they had already initiated back last year?
Yeah, absolutely. So like Carol mentioned, COVID is still a recognized hazard, and it is an obligation of every employer to provide a employment that is free from recognized hazards. And just because employees are vaccinated doesn't mean that COVID is still not a hazard and a pandemic issue. So if COVID were to break out at your business or consumers got sick at your place and you were trying to eliminate COVID by doing temperature checks or COVID tests, then you as an employer would have some legal fallback. You would have the ability to show that you tried. So even if COVID enters, you still tried, and the fines may be released. OSHA gives an abatement period for all citations. When they issue a citation, you have 30 days to abate, which means to show that you have mitigated and to show that you have done temperature checks or COVID tests at entrance would actually help and could remove that citation for you here. So even if employees are vaccinated, it is still a recognized hazard that employers should try to remove from the employment.
Thank you. And everyone continue to add your questions. We'll keep answering them. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you. So what if an employee refuses to return to work? Let's say they want to take leave. You've done your best you've communicated with them, they know what the safety protocols are. However, they're like, you know what, I don't want to come back to the workplace. I need to take a leave of absence. So back to what we said earlier, you want to make sure that your managers, the people that manage and supervise your employees, are trained on what to do if they get a request like this. So before rushing to a decision, make sure they're trained on who's handling these requests, because there could be potential reasons that you want to provide accommodations. So what's the reason for the request? Is the employee concerned about their own personal health, or maybe someone at home, like Carol mentioned earlier? And if so, I mean, what does the law require? So that's why you want to make sure this request gets to the right person. Or is the employee concerned about reasonable safety concerns? Are there some things that they see in the workplace or that they don't see that concerns them, and that's the reason for not wanting to come back to work? In that case, that activity might be considered protected as well. So again, you want to make sure that when someone says they want to take a leave, that you don't jump to an answer right away, that you get them to the right person and you discover, why are we taking this leave? What's the reason for the request? What does the law require? And then what does your policy say? So if your policy offers leave for other similar conditions, you might want to offer leave here. So you want to be consistent. If you don't have a written policy, you want to examine what you've done in the past so that you're consistent in your methods. Next.
So it's also going to be important for the employer to consider the Americans with Disabilities Act when people are refusing to return to work. And what are their requirements? What is the Americans with Disabilities Act, and how is it going to affect you as the employer? What has happened here is, since more and more people have started to return to work, the employees are asking employers for accommodations under the Americans with Disabilities Act in record numbers since returning to work. And employees know that if they have a disability and an accommodation will help them to perform the essential functions of the job, the employer must consider it if it is reasonable, unless there's undue hardship. So there's significant difficulty or expense in focusing on resources and circumstances of particular employers in the relationship to the cost or difficulty of providing that accommodation. That might be undue hardship. But in my experience in doing employment law for many years, undue hardship is very difficult for employers to prove under the ADA. So you have to look at your particular situation and see whether or not you're required to provide an accommodation. And that basically starts with the interactive process. Does the person have a disability? So very broadly interpreted under the ADA is the definition of disability, which is a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. So when you look at this, you have to determine, does the person have a disability? And that is not always easy for you to determine right off the bat. And so what I've done in my practice, and which is allowed under the Americans with Disabilities Act, is to get medical advice. Allow the employee to take a form to a medical provider of their choice and to find out if this doctor feels like this person is unable to perform the essential functions of the job with or without an accommodation. And doctors can be very helpful in giving you this kind of information, because they may say that they think the person can perform the job without any accommodation. So you have an answer then for you about whether or not an accommodation might be necessary. But they may also give you ideas about the types of accommodation that might be necessary for this employee to perform the essential functions of the job. I think the hardest types of disabilities for people to understand are going to be those that are mental impairments of some type. They don't know the extent to what the person can do or what the person can't do. And by relying on medical advice, which is allowed under the ADA, this is assisting them to determine what type of accommodation they, by law, might be required to provide. And so you want to look also about the accommodations, because the key is the accommodation reasonable? So an employee can't just make a demand for an accommodation and insist that that's the one that they have to have. Because in the situation or the work situation that they're in, it may not be reasonable for the employer to accommodate them in the way that they want. Or the accommodation may be so expensive that it might be undue hardship for the employer to provide it. So they have to look at all of these issues determining, and this is all part of what we call the interactive process. And the interactive process really is a lot of communication back and forth between you and the person that is asking for or might need an accommodation, particularly when they're returning to work. Just fear of returning to work is really not going to be enough to get an accommodation under the ADA. You actually have to have something specific, a physical or a mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. So it just can't be fear of coming back to work. So you're going to be faced with people. I'm just afraid I can't come back to work, but that's going to require you to delve more fully into whether or not this person has a disability at all, and whether or not you can provide them with a reasonable accommodation. So a lot of the people wonder, do I have to provide remote work as an accommodation? Well, remote work was allowed for a number of reasons when we were in the middle of the pandemic. And we didn't really know at the beginning. If you remember, almost everybody that could be was placed on remote work at home because businesses were closed completely. It's hard to think about that when we look back, but for a month, most businesses in our area were closed, and in most of the areas around the country, and in a lot of places, particularly in places like California and other states, the businesses only recently started to reopen and allow people to return to work. So remote work may or may not be an accommodation that meets this person's disability, if they even have one. So you have to consider that, and you may find that remote work works. For instance, if a person has immune disorder and you are not able in the workplace to make sure that they have some safety or protection in your workplace, and if they've asked you for an accommodation of continuing in remote work, this might be reasonable at this time to allow it, but you must always have a remote work policy, and that policy should make it clear that this remote work ability by the employee is at the discretion of the employer, and that this is something that later on you may request again that they come back to work and revisit these same issues in order to determine whether remote work is going to continue to work for your business. You also need to consider states where employees work requires additional protections or accommodations. And certain states have laws that are different than the ADA that provide more protections under the ADA. For instance, Florida has its own complete act for dealing with the disabilities of persons and accommodations, and how to keep them working, and how to deal with the essential functions of a job. And this whole thing about accommodations might have greater protections in Florida, for instance, than we have in the state of Texas. So you have to look at where are your workers, and consider if your workers are in different places in the country, whether or not those states require you to make protections and accommodations that you may not be required to make in Texas, that are over and above what the ADA provides. So next slide.
Thank you, Carol. That was a lot of great information. So in the sake of time, we have about 15 minutes left. We are going to run through this section on recruiting and retention. It is important. And if you want further information, please feel free to reach out to us. We'll have our emails at the end of the slideshow. But I'm going to quickly run through this section as far as recruiting and retention. And a lot of experts are saying the next pandemic is the great rehiring. And the other thing you want to take into consideration when you are recruiting and retaining your talent is the gender gap information, pay information, diversity, equity, inclusion, and also burnout. And what are some things that you could do to help recruiting and retention? And so one of the important things that we want to address about is getting it right legally. Carol?
I'm just going to quickly tell you, one of the things that's important is when you're getting it right legally, social media is used in job applications. When people are applying for a job, make sure you're looking at the law when you're using social media, because we all turn to social media to get information, but some of the information you get off social media could be a violation of Title VII and the ADA and GINA. So look at that. The other issue is company culture. You hear that word all the time in workplaces, and I want you to look at, for company culture, make sure you're not looking at people that come in that we want them to be exactly like you, all right? Because that could lead you down the wrong path on Title VII. And the last thing is interviews under the new Zoom interview protocol that we have going on. You could be asked illegal questions or told illegal information by people that you're interviewing. And so if you're recording this interview, you need to know how to handle those illegal type inquiries and make sure that you're not putting on the record something that would violate the law that is now going to be a permanent record that could be used in a lawsuit against the company. Moving on.
Great point, great point. So what's causing the retention and the recruiting issues? And so a lot of it is lack of the communication from employers, poor culture, accountability, advancement opportunities. And so what's important for companies to be able to retain their talent? So, you know, are you communicating with your employees on a basis? If you don't have some type of quarterly meeting with your employees, I would highly suggest that. Have some type of interactive games, have some type of fun environment where employees can have fun in the interim of also delivering information. Do your employees have advancement opportunities? So it's not always about vertical or horizontal. It's also about just learning and coaching and reskilling your employees, which we'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. Employees crave opportunities and they want personal growth. So what can you do for your employees? Try engaging your employees with creating teams, create projects. What are some committees that you could do? Could you start a book club? Could you start an exercise group? Managers need to know what motivates their employees and what the employees value. I thought this slide here was very interesting as far as the statistics on there. Here's another statistics that might scare you. 4 million people quit their job in April, according to New York Times. They expect the numbers for May and June to go even higher. There's a new quote or a new phrase out there that's called rage quitting. And this is on the rise for those who hate their jobs, for employees and employers. But it's more complicated if employees like their job. And keep in mind the statistics for replacing an employee can be 2 times their salary and can take up to 2 years for the employee to acclimate to the workplace. So what's causing this problem? It's a backlog of employees who didn't want to quit or couldn't quit during the pandemic. And now people are quitting because they're stressed out, they're burned out. And part of that problem is because a lot of employers, one, can't afford to hire people to replace people that already quit or left. And so the workload is going on other employees. So make sure that you are addressing that with the employees and present it as, that you're adapting their skills and that you're bringing more value in them to the workplace. One of the other statistics you want to talk about is bringing the employees back to the workplace. As we touched on earlier, make sure you communicate to the employees. What are the safety protocols? What are the COVID protocols? How are you going to bring back your employees? Have you done a survey with your employees as far as who should come back to the workplace and who shouldn't? Have you asked your employees about a hybrid work model? What does a hybrid work model mean? And one of the important things on the retention aspect of things is what's called an open door policy. Carol, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I will talk about that. Just that most of you are familiar with this because one of the things when I review people's handbooks for employers, I look at their open door policy and I make sure that they have an open door policy because it aids in retention. It also helps the employer because lawsuits happen when employees don't find satisfaction on the job or are frustrated by harassment, bias, unfair treatment. You know, the Department of Labor talks about if you work with the agency on a regular basis, like I do, they get this Friday afternoon overwhelming number of claims start coming in the door. And it's because people they're so frustrated with their workplace. And so they go to the Department of Labor, they bring claims, wage and hour, all kinds of OSHA claims come in on Friday afternoon. So open door, it's got to be handled by the right person. You can resolve issues of harassment, discrimination, and the hostile work environment so that people feel, oh, I don't feel safe here. I'm not happy here. I'm not being treated well here, but I can go to someone and they have a policy and they actually have a way that I can go in, I can talk to someone, and they have a hierarchy of how it's going to be resolved. And employees will not continue to work where good communication is missing, just as Carla and Sheila have talked about already, that they have to know there's good communication and that they're problem solving what is going on and what's missing in the workplace. So next slide.
Great points, Carol. I've always said I don't like payday and Friday, so yes. So recruiting, you know, if last year wasn't bad enough, now we have a pandemic of 2021 with a large pool of candidates, fewer jobs, and still we are having shortages. Over 1,500 people were surveyed by LinkedIn, and they said that 3 of the topics are virtual hiring, DE&I, diversity, equity, inclusion, and skill sets. And so these are the top 3 things that recruiters or employers can do to kind of help curb the recruiting trend. So virtual hiring, as Carol mentioned before, a lot of people are starting to do virtual hiring. Be careful in your virtual hiring. Be careful if you're recording Zooms or any kind of interviews. A lot of people are moving to a lot of virtual interviews, and then the last step is going to be bringing that person indoors or into the office to do a face-to-face meeting, and that's quite all right. So a lot of experts have also said that 2021 is not the year to build talent. 2021 is the year to build skill set within your employees. So as I mentioned before, a lot of companies are not hiring people to replace people that have left or where they had to quit out jobs. And so what you should do now is teach your employees about skill sets, help your employees adapt to learning more skills. You know, could they learn a new task? Could you assess the job description? Could you assess what they do on a day-to-day basis? And make sure you teach them and make them understand what they do on a day-to-day basis and how it fits into the larger picture of the company. One of the other things you want to talk about is diversity, equity, inclusion. 47% of talent professionals told LinkedIn that hiring managers are not held accountable for interviewing a diverse slate of candidates. So as I mentioned, look at your job descriptions. Where are you posting your ads? Where are you getting your candidates from? Do you really need a degree for this position? Do you really need this much experience for this position? So make sure assessing the whole thing. As we reviewed policies during COVID, let's review all of our policies, and especially those that come to the hiring and recruiting side of things. I thought this was an interesting statistic as well. 1 in 4 U.S. employees plan to leave their jobs once the pandemic subsides. So we're definitely going to have an issue on our hands, and now is the time to start preparing for that issue. So one of the other problems, if you will, that's adding to the recruiting and retention issue is a lack of applicants and interviews, and even no-shows is something that we're having to deal with. And so a couple of things I want to make you aware of. June 26, 2021, Texas opted out of the additional pandemic unemployment assistance. And what that was the $300 a month that people who were on unemployment were getting. That ends as of actually last Saturday. And so what's happening now, and actually, I don't know if you guys are aware of this, is there is a child tax credit, which everybody knows about that. But because of the American Rescues Act, they are now going to start giving advanced monthly payments beginning on July 15th that will actually go through December 15th. And this tax care credit can be anywhere from, I believe it's $500 a month, all the way up to like $1,000 a month. It just depends on how old your children are, if you qualify for it. those kind of type things. I'm not going to go over the eligibility things that are qualified, but it's important for you to understand that this is another feather in the hat, if you will, that could cause a problem for recruiters and for companies out there trying to retain talent. So what do you do? What do you do to try to retain your talent? What do you do to try to recruit people to come to you? So according to Indeed.com, the median hourly wage for non-medical essential jobs has risen by 2%. In fact, Starbucks offered a temporary bump for $3 an hour for employees. Even places like H-E-B and Kroger are also offering hourly increases for wage workers. So keep in mind, a lot of employers can't afford to pay their employees more money. So what do? Obviously, you can create more incentives. You could do some type of bonus if you wanted to. And also think about non-monetary incentives. So things like mental health resources, free meals. What about free meal prepping programs, grocery delivery, childcare assistance, expanding your leave policies, reimbursements, membership to streaming services. So there are a lot of different things that you could do that aren't just monetary. There are other things that you could do that would help the employees feel like they're, like they matter to the company. One of the other things to keep in mind, LinkedIn and Indeed.com have new filters that is hashtag ready to work. And so this is a clear indicator for people who are ready to go back to work and are eager to go back to work. So that may help you when you're looking for employees. So last but not least, as an employer, if you have offered somebody a position and they've turned it down, make sure you notify the state agencies for unemployment, because this could impact their unemployment assistance. So ensure that you're doing that. And we put in the websites here. And last but not least, communicate. I can't say that enough. And so I'm going to turn it over to Carla for some key points to remember.
Yes, on vaccines, just remember to adhere to local, state, and federal regulations. There's no one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to your business or to your employees. And when it comes to employee refusals to return to work, think about what the root cause is, if it's safety concerns or something going on at home, but take your time before you make a decision. And when it comes to recruiting and retention, think outside the box. Sheila just had some great ideas, like a streaming service, paying for something like that. And then most importantly, probably consult with HR. So consult with your HR professional, your safety professional, or your attorney to get some guidance here, because it's ever changing. And we want to just thank you all for attending, and thank you to Carol Keough from the Keough Law Firm. We appreciate your insight. It was very helpful and we've learned a lot. We will reach out to you guys and give you all a copy of this presentation. And if you have any questions, our contact information is here. We love to hear from you. So thank you for attending.
Great. Carol, were there any other questions that came in?
I'm glad you asked. There was one, if anybody wants to stick around for it. Can we require customers coming into the workplace to be vaccinated? And if so, can we confirm it?
That's a good question. Who wants to take that one?
Carol.
Actually, you have to look at, for customers coming into the workplace, you have to look at what Texas law is doing. And if you remember Governor Abbott, he has made some executive orders that could affect you in Texas, and not serving or not allowing unvaccinated people to come into the workplace. And so he has said you can't refuse service to someone simply because they're unvaccinated. So they're not really required to tell you if they're vaccinated or not. If you look at H-E-B and you look at any of these places, all of their signs for masking have now said that, that they're asking that people are unvaccinated, please wear a mask. But they can't run up to you and say, are you vaccinated or are you unvaccinated? So that's part of the tricky part about it. But the governor really, he has stated that you still have to serve people. You can't say, oh, you can't come in my restaurant, you're not vaccinated. So so because of his restrictions, you have to be careful, because that's an executive order. And as the governor, we're required to follow the executive orders that he gives out. And so I think it's a little bit tricky right now for anyone to just flat out refuse service or demand that somebody tell them if they're vaccinated or not vaccinated. So because that is still private health information, and he's not requiring vaccine passports or any of that type of thing.
Great point.
Very good. And
Any
then
other
one last one came in. Would an incentive of gift cards for getting vaccinated be taxable to the employee, say if the amount was $20?
I think whether or not it's going to be taxable is going to be whether it's a discretionary or non-discretionary bonus. And so if it's how it's considered under the law is going to make a difference as to whether or not it's going to be included in their income and whether or not it's going to affect it being taxed or not. So that's something to consider. That's something you have to kind of look a little bit beyond, I think, when you're looking at the incentives in the beginning and setting up your policy. You know, I think you can also get help from your CPA too about, you know, is this going to be a taxable benefit to my employees? Is this something I'm going to have to take, you know, money out of, or is this something they're going to be taxed on later? Because I think they want to know that. I think that's information they want to know. So I usually, when it comes to the tax issues, I usually look to, you know, my accountant, my bookkeeper, and my, you know, or my CPA to really give expert guidance on taxes, what's going to be taxed, what's not going to be taxed. So that, and usually you have them either on your staff or they're, you know, someone always has someone to handle all the accounting and the tax work for the company usually, and that's the person to, I think, go to for guidance on that.
And that's a real good point, Carol, because there are, you know, as long as y'all know that some gift cards type incentives can be taxed, but, you know, some de minimis or very small amounts will not fall in that. So that's what we do the same thing, Carol, as we get with our payroll team and our accounting team. So good advice. Thank you. And I don't see any questions now, but if any pop up in the next couple minutes, Sheila, Carla, I'll go ahead and we'll include those and send that information out to you. And don't forget, we've got our HRCI credit for all you HR certified folks. We'll be sending that out also.
Thank you, Cheryl.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
I just
Thank
again
you.
would like to thank you, Carol, Carla, and Michael for joining us today. Thank you everyone else for joining us, and thank you for taking time out of your day. And we will follow up with you shortly with the recording of the webinar and all the other pertinent information. Thank you and have a
Thank
great
you.
day.